It looked like the perfect royal wedding. On July 29th, 1981, millions of people around the world watched as 19-year-old Diana Spencer stepped out in that famous wedding dress and became the Princess of Wales. The dress, the carriage, the crowds, and then that balcony kiss. It was the kind of moment that felt like the beginning of a fairy tale. But behind all the cameras and celebrations, something was already wrong. Charles and Diana's marriage had barely begun, yet the problems that would eventually tear them apart were already there. The age difference, their completely different personalities, the enormous pressure of royal life, and, perhaps most importantly, the things neither of them could openly talk about. From the outside, they looked like the perfect couple. Behind closed doors, their relationship was far more complicated. And what happened over the next few years wasn't caused by one argument, one betrayal, or one terrible decision. Their marriage slowly became a collision between two very different people living under extraordinary pressure. So how did one of the most famous weddings in modern history end in separation and divorce? And were Charles and Diana ever really given a chance to have the happy ending the world expected? To understand what happened, we have to go back to the very beginning. Before the wedding, before the scandals, and before the public realized just how troubled their marriage had become. Let's start with the story most people already sense, even if they don't fully understand the details: Camilla. Long before Charles ever met Diana, he had already found the woman many close to him believed he truly loved. Camilla Shand, later Camilla Parker Bowles, entered Charles's life in the early 1970s. The two shared genuine common interests: horses, country life, a similar sense of humour, and by most accounts, an emotional ease with each other that Charles rarely displayed in public. But the timing was wrong. Charles was still establishing his role within the royal family, still serving in the Royal Navy, and the relationship never solidified into anything permanent before Camilla married someone else in 1973. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Even after Camilla's marriage, she and Charles remained close, and by the time Charles began seriously considering marriage himself, years later, that closeness had never fully faded. The royal establishment of the era operated under a set of expectations that left little room for complicated romantic histories. A future king needed a bride who was young, aristocratic, and, crucially, without a past that might embarrass the institution. Camilla, already married and with a documented prior relationship with Charles, simply didn't fit that mold, regardless of how the two of them actually felt about each other. Enter Diana Spencer. Diana came from exactly the kind of background the royal family was looking for. She was the daughter of an earl, part of the British aristocracy, and crucially, at just 19 years old when she and Charles began courting, she carried none of the romantic history that had disqualified Camilla. On paper, she was close to perfect. In reality, she was a teenager being quietly evaluated for a role she barely understood, while the man courting her was still emotionally entangled with someone else entirely. That imbalance, her innocence and his complicated past, would define the entire relationship before it had even become an engagement. Reports from people close to the family at the time described Prince Philip growing increasingly impatient with his son. Charles was in his early 30s, considered by royal standards to be dangerously close to set in his ways for a bachelor prince, and pressure was mounting for him to choose a bride and move forward. Philip is said to have sent Charles a message essentially telling him to either commit to Diana or release her, since dragging out the courtship indefinitely wasn't fair to her and was becoming a public relations concern for the family. Charles, by several accounts, interpreted that message less as fatherly advice and more as a directive. And so, in February 1981, the engagement was announced. From the outside, it looked like a triumph. From the inside, according to people who later spoke about that period, it looked more like two people being steered toward an arrangement neither of them had fully chosen on their own terms. The signs of trouble surfaced almost immediately and nowhere more publicly than during their official engagement interview. Sitting side by side in front of the cameras, a reporter asked the couple whether they were in love. Diana answered without hesitation, of course. Charles, visibly uncomfortable, added a now infamous qualifier, whatever in love means. It was a small moment, barely a few seconds of footage, but it became one of the most replayed and most analysed exchanges in royal history, a crack in the fairy tale, visible to anyone paying close attention months before the wedding had even happened. Diana herself later described feeling a growing sense of dread as the wedding approached. The couple had spent very little time together before the engagement, and even less time truly getting to know each other afterward, given the intense scrutiny and packed schedule that came with royal life. By some accounts, weeks before the wedding, Diana discovered a piece of jewellery Charles had privately commissioned as a gift for Camilla, a bracelet engraved with nicknames the two of them had used for each other. For a young woman about to marry the future King of England in front of the entire world, the discovery reportedly left her shaken, feeling as though she was walking into a lie that everyone else had already agreed to keep from her. Some accounts even suggest that Diana considered calling off the wedding entirely the night before it happened, only to be told by those around her that it was simply too late. Her face was already on the souvenirs. The commemorative plates, the mugs, the newspapers, the entire world's expectations had already been set in motion, and there was no version of events where a 19-year-old could unilaterally stop it. So on July 29th, 1981, in front of a global television audience estimated at 750 million people, Diana Spencer became the Princess of Wales. The wedding itself was, by any measure, a spectacle. The dress with its 25-foot train, the carriage procession through the streets of London, the ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral rather than the more traditional Westminster Abbey, all of it built to project stability, romance and continuity for an institution that badly needed a moment of unifying celebration. And for one day, it worked. The crowds were enormous. The images are still, to this day, among the most recognisable in modern royal history. But a wedding, no matter how spectacular, cannot manufacture compatibility that was never there to begin with. Once the cameras moved on and the actual marriage began, the fundamental mismatch between Charles and Diana became harder and harder to hide. With a 13-year age gap between them, the two had strikingly little in common. Different interests, different social instincts, and critically, different emotional languages. Both, in fact, came from childhoods that had left them somewhat emotionally guarded, Charles raised within the famously reserved, duty-first culture of the royal household. And Diana raised amid her own parents' difficult divorce, and a somewhat unstable, shuffled around childhood of her own. Neither had been given much of a template for how to build genuine emotional intimacy, and instead of helping each other fill that gap, their very different personalities, his reserved and stoic, hers expressive and increasingly anxious, only widened the distance between them. Diana struggled significantly during the early years of the marriage, isolated by the intensity of public attention and the rigid formality of royal life, and by her own later accounts dealing with serious struggles around her mental health and self-image during this period, largely without the support system she needed. Charles, for his part, continued his long-standing friendship with Camilla, who by this point had become, in effect, a constant presence just outside the frame of the official royal narrative. Then came a factor almost nobody could have fully predicted going in: the sheer scale of Diana's global popularity. From the moment she stepped into public life, Diana connected with people in a way that was almost unprecedented for a member of the royal family. She was young, warm, visibly uncomfortable with the stuffiness of royal formality in a way that made her instantly relatable, and unusually willing to show genuine emotion in public, hugging children, sitting with AIDS patients at a time when the disease carried enormous public stigma, and generally projecting a kind of humanity that felt entirely new for the institution. That popularity became especially undeniable during the couple's 1983 tour of Australia and New Zealand, one of their first major overseas tours as a married couple. Crowds gathered by the thousands along the planned routes, and by multiple accounts, the reaction split sharply depending on which side of the street people found themselves standing. Those who ended up on Diana's side cheered. Those who ended up on Charles's side visibly groaned with disappointment, sometimes loudly enough for the couple themselves to hear it. For Charles, who had spent literally his entire life being raised and positioned as the central eventual figure of the British monarchy, watching his own wife eclipse him so completely and so publicly reportedly became a genuine and growing source of resentment. It wasn't just an ego issue, it represented a real disruption to a role he had been groomed for since birth. And it added yet another fracture line to a marriage that was already struggling under the weight of everything else. By the mid-1980s, the cracks had become difficult to fully conceal, even with the machinery of royal public relations working to maintain appearances. Diana, by several accounts, grew increasingly aware that Charles's relationship with Camilla had never actually ended, despite outward appearances. Charles, for his part, appeared to settle into a kind of quiet resignation, treating the marriage as an obligation to be managed rather than a partnership to be nurtured. The public didn't get the full picture until years later, but insiders, staff, and close friends of both parties were reportedly well aware that the marriage existed by that point, largely for the sake of appearances and the two young sons it had produced, Prince William, born in 1982, and Prince Harry, born in 1984. Through the late 1980s, both Charles and Diana began, separately, to seek emotional connection outside the marriage. Diana's own relationships during this period have been the subject of extensive public discussion over the decades since. Charles's continued closeness with Camilla became, by the early 1990s, essentially an open secret among royal insiders, even if it hadn't yet become fully public knowledge. That changed dramatically in 1992 and 1993, when a series of leaked private phone conversations published across British tabloids exposed the reality that both the public and much of the media had suspected for years. One particularly infamous leaked call between Charles and Camilla, which came to be known in the press by a crude nickname referencing an offhand comment Charles made during the conversation, became a national scandal and effectively confirmed what insiders had long known privately. By December 1992, the British Prime Minister formally announced the couple's separation to Parliament. The fairy tale, at least in its original form, was officially over. What followed was one of the most dramatic and closely watched periods in modern royal history. Diana, freed to some degree from the formal constraints of a functioning marriage, began speaking more openly about her experiences, the isolation, the difficulty of royal life, and specifically, the impact of Charles's relationship with Camilla on her own well-being. That culminated in her now famous 1995 television interview, in which she directly acknowledged the strain the relationship with Camilla had placed on the marriage, describing the situation in terms that left no ambiguity about how she understood what had happened. The interview sent shockwaves through the royal establishment and the public alike. It was almost unheard of at that point for a senior royal to speak so directly and so publicly about the private failures of a marriage. For many viewers, it was also the moment the public fully understood, in Diana's own words, just how isolating and painful those years inside the institution had actually been for her. The couple's formal divorce was finalized in August 1996, bringing to an official close a marriage that had, by most honest accounts, been struggling almost from its very first year. Diana retained the title Princess of Wales, though she lost the formal style of Her Royal Highness, a distinction that itself became a small but symbolically loaded point of controversy at the time. Just over a year later, in August 1997, Diana died in a car crash in Paris, an event that triggered an outpouring of public grief unlike almost anything Britain had seen in the modern era. Crowds gathered outside royal residences by the hundreds of thousands. The funeral drew a global television audience estimated in the billions. And in the years since, Diana's legacy, both as a mother and as a genuinely transformative public figure, has arguably only grown, shaping how younger generations of royals understand the relationship between duty, image, and authentic public connection. Charles, for his part, eventually married Camilla in 2005 in a wedding that was, by design, far more modest and understated than his first. A quiet acknowledgement, in its own way, of everything the public had already lived through alongside them. Camilla was in time given the title Queen Consort and later simply Queen upon Charles's accession to the throne in 2022. A resolution that, decades earlier, would have seemed almost unthinkable given how strictly the institution had once tried to keep the two of them apart. Looking back now, what's remarkable isn't really that the marriage fell apart. Given everything working against it from the very beginning, the unresolved relationship with Camilla, the intense external pressure to marry quickly, the enormous age and life experience gap, the fundamental mismatch in personality and emotional needs, and eventually, the destabilizing imbalance created by Diana's overwhelming global popularity. The ending was, in hindsight, close to inevitable. What's actually remarkable is how long the public believed, or wanted to believe, that it wouldn't happen. How completely the imagery of that one wedding day in 1981 managed to paper over years of warning signs that, in retrospect, were visible almost from the very beginning. Diana's story didn't end with her divorce, and it certainly didn't end with her death. Her influence is still felt today in how the younger generation of royals, William and Harry most directly, but the institution more broadly, approach the balance between public duty and personal authenticity, mental health, and the risks of an institution that historically valued image over honesty. So the next time you see photos from that wedding day in 1981, the dress, the carriage, the balcony kiss, it's worth remembering everything that was already happening quietly behind the scenes, long before any of it became public knowledge. Let us know in the comments which factor you think mattered most in the end. The unresolved relationship with Camilla, the intense pressure to marry quickly, or the personality mismatch that never had a real chance to work itself out. And if you want us to go even deeper into the 1983 Australia tour, the leaked phone call scandal, or the full story behind Diana's 1995 interview, let us know in the comments. We'll bring you that story next. Thank you for watching.